Looks like Private Polisher is on duty. A cadet snickered, nudging his friend. Missed a whole platoon's worth of dirt there. Should we report it to the Provost Marshal? Laughter rippled through the polished hall as the old man, Staff Sergeant Major Tom Hayes, bent to collect another discarded tray. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. Just kept buffing slow, steady, like he'd done it a million times. Like he'd seen far worse than arrogance in a cadet's eyes. He was just the head of custodial services. Until the 4-star general, stepping onto the stage, paused, walked past the dignitaries, and stood before him. "Command Sergeant Major Hayes," she said, raising a crisp salute. "It's an honor to finally stand before you." The entire room froze. Cadets who once laughed now stood speechless. They had no idea who he really was. And in the next few minutes, their rigid world of rank and protocol was about to be profoundly shaken. The thing about Staff Sergeant Major Tom Hayes was that you could pass him every day and barely register his presence. At 66, with a closely trimmed gray beard and a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand that never quite went away, Tom had cultivated a deep sense of calm. He was the head of custodial services at Fortis Point Military Institute, had been for 8 years. He buffed the same parade grounds, sanitized the same barracks, and replaced the same dim bulbs in the historic Commandant's building. To most cadets, he was just part of the institution's infrastructure. The guy with a heavy ring of keys, a floor buffer in one hand, and a faded Army Ranger baseball cap pulled low over eyes that seemed to hold distant memories. They had no idea he used to go by a different name. Command Sergeant Major Hayes. Before the hum of the polishing machine and the scent of disinfectant, Tom had been deployed 7 times. Afghanistan, Syria, the remote training grounds of the American Southwest, places where the stakes were always life and death. He'd served with the elite 75th Ranger Regiment for 28 years, half of them commanding men in direct action. He wasn't a general, but he was a legend among those who knew the real cost of freedom. He'd led recovery missions deep behind enemy lines. Secured critical intelligence during chaotic withdrawals. Once in the contested hills of Marja, he'd personally overseen the evacuation of vital personnel under relentless mortar fire, ensuring every single American made it out. That's where he took shrapnel to his hand. At Fortis Point, nobody asked about the tremor. And Tom didn't offer. Not the tremor. Not the campaigns. Not the Silver Star or the Legion of Merit that lay in a locked footlocker in his small apartment. Most people just didn't want to hear about that kind of thing. Cadets were absorbed in their training. Instructors were focused on their curricula. And the institute administrators, well, they liked that he ran a tight, efficient crew, and never made demands. The supply office in the South Barracks basement was where Tom maintained his small, orderly world. It smelled like bleach and boot polish. There was an old crackling AM/FM radio he listened to at lunch, a bulletin board covered in faded safety notices, and a sturdy wooden chair where he ate his lunch. Tacked to the wall above his desk was a small creased photograph. 6 young men in camouflaged uniforms. Mud-stained, exhausted, but with an unyielding determination in their eyes. 2 were gone now. 4 still stood, including Tom. He looked younger in the photo. Unburdened. Ready. Every night, before securing the building, he'd press 2 fingers to the photo. A silent tribute. A solemn vow. He didn't crave recognition. He just wanted to know that their sacrifices were not forgotten. Then came Cadet First Class Jordan Miller. 20. Sharp-edged uniform. A preppy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The kind of cadet who believed leadership was about swagger and showing off. Miller came from a storied line of American Army Air Corps and later, Air Force pilots. His grandfather had flown bombers, his father had commanded fighter squadrons, and now Jordan strutted the institute halls as if his general stars were already gleaming on his shoulders. He knew the regulations, but he hadn't yet learned the deeper lessons of true command, empathy, quiet strength, and genuine humility. To someone like Jordan, Tom Hayes was merely a relic. It started subtly. A discarded energy drink can left just after Tom had swept. A muttered joke as Tom passed. "Looks like Private Polisher is on duty." Jordan always laughed the loudest. The disrespect wasn't always shouted, but it was always audible enough for Tom to hear, and quiet enough for the instructors to dismiss. One afternoon, as Tom slowly navigated his buffer down the academic corridor, Jordan and a group of first-year cadets mimicked his hand tremor. "Attention, Sergeant Scrub," Jordan announced, snapping a ridiculous mock salute. The hallway erupted in snickers. Tom didn't react. Not with a word. Not even a glance. He just continued his work, steady as always. This only emboldened them. One morning before the commandant's inspection, someone left a trail of muddy boot prints and a crumpled mess of cafeteria trays directly in Tom's newly cleaned path. It was clearly staged, deliberately placed. As Tom bent down to clean it, Jordan stood nearby, sipping coffee. "Morning, Sergeant Sweep," he said with a smirk. "Missed a whole platoon's worth of dirt there. Should we report it to the Provost Marshal?" The group chuckled. Another cadet made exaggerated sweeping motions with his hands. Still no reaction. Tom collected each piece of trash without rushing, without looking up. If he heard them, he gave no sign. If he felt shame, he never showed it. But the truth was, Tom Hayes had faced far worse than boys in crisp uniforms pretending to be men. He'd seen young Rangers bleed out on foreign soil, heard their last words, carried their names in his soul long after the gunfire ceased. Compared to that, the taunts of a few arrogant cadets were merely background noise. But Jordan Miller didn't know that. To him, Tom was irrelevant. Someone to be ignored or mocked, never respected. No one asked why Tom always paused at the Institute's Wall of Valor before his shift. No one wondered why his uniform, though simple, was always immaculate. No one thought to ask what retired truly meant on that worn cap. And the instructors, some noticed the behavior, a few looked uncomfortable, but no one intervened. Not yet. It was just cadet hijinks, they reasoned. But every joke chipped away at something larger, not Tom's dignity, but their own. Because leadership isn't measured by how you treat those above you, it's revealed by how you treat those beneath you. And soon enough, they were going to learn the difference. Before he was Tom the custodian, he was Command Sergeant Major Thomas Hayes, a Special Forces Master Sergeant who led the most dangerous and forgotten missions, so covert that most of their operations never saw a single headline. He didn't wear his past on his sleeve, but it was there, etched into the deep lines around his eyes, hidden in the slight tremor that never fully healed, and buried deep behind a gaze that had once scanned hostile landscapes for threats no civilian could ever imagine. Years ago, far from the polished floors of Fortis Point, Tom had led a small Green Beret detachment in a joint operation during a critical withdrawal in the Middle East. The mission was called Operation Ghostfire, a last-ditch effort to secure sensitive intelligence deep inside collapsing territory. Intelligence had failed. Communications were down. The only thing standing between priceless data and utter loss was Command Sergeant Major Hayes and his team. They made it back, the intelligence secured, but not all of them. Tom never spoke about what happened in the shadowed valleys north of Baghdad, but he carried it, every step, every night, every time a siren wailed or a cadet's voice echoed too loudly in the mess hall. He remembered, not because he wanted to, but because forgetting would feel like betrayal. His team had nicknamed him the Silent Hand, not just because of his precision, but because of what he endured. After retirement, when the Pentagon offered him a high-level consulting role, he declined. He didn't want a desk, a medal ceremony, or another round of politics masquerading as patriotism. He wanted something quieter, something that let him remain connected to the military world without being consumed by it. So he chose Fortis Point, not because they knew him, but because they didn't. And maybe that was his quiet protest, a way of showing what real service looks like, not loud, not celebrated, but steady, invisible, and tireless. The irony was heartbreaking. Heroes like Tom don't crave glory, but the world often overlooks them anyway. They blend into the background. They push buffers instead of pens, ride public transport instead of limousines, and stand in silence while the very country they bled for walks past without a second glance. The medals stored in a humble box, the commendations yellowing in a drawer. Because Tom Hayes didn't need reminders of who he was. He lived it every day. And if anyone had taken the time to truly see him, to look past the cleaning supplies and the faded cap, they might have caught a glimpse of something extraordinary. A man who had once commanded men in battle, who had watched brothers fall, and who now chose a life of quiet dignity in the shadows of the next generation. But no one asked. No one saw. Not yet. Because to them, he was just the custodian. And that, perhaps more than anything, was the loudest silence of all. The day of the annual leadership convention arrived like a hurricane. The Fortis Point Military Institute's Grand Assembly Hall had never gleamed brighter. The oak floors were polished to a mirror sheen. Flags stood rigid in their polished stands. Cadets filed in, row by row, uniforms sharp enough to slice glass. Medals glinted under the spotlights, and collars sat perfectly pressed. Every boot was shined, every hair precisely parted. This was the Institute's premier event, a chance to impress, to stand tall, to be noticed. But beneath all the pomp and ceremony, tension lingered. You could feel it in the way cadets adjusted their ties one last time, or in the way instructors paced the aisles with radios in hand. This year's keynote speaker was no ordinary guest. General Abigail Vance, a 4-star officer, a battlefield-hardened legend. She wasn't just a name in textbooks, she was the architect of modern counterinsurgency tactics, a survivor of grueling urban campaigns, and a commander whose strategies were still studied at the highest levels of military academia. The woman had mentored generals who now trained others. As the massive double doors swung open, a hushed anticipation fell across the hall. She stepped inside, tall, resolute, calm as a mountain peak. Her presence alone commanded silence. The ribbons on her chest told 1,000 stories. Her boots didn't stomp, they announced authority with every step. Everyone stood. The room rose in unison. Salutes snapped to attention like a perfectly synchronized wave across generations of military reverence. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Instead of making her way to the podium, where a polished microphone and rows of seated dignitaries awaited her, General Vance kept walking. Past the front row. Past the stage. Past the flags and the prepared speech on the lectern. She didn't pause. She didn't nod. She didn't even glance at the commanders awaiting introduction. She walked straight toward the back of the hall, toward the side entrance, toward the custodial staff. Towards Tom Hayes. And in that moment, so brief it almost didn't register, time seemed to hold its breath. The cadets shifted in confusion. Instructors exchanged puzzled glances. Even the brass on stage leaned forward, uncertain. Only one person moved with full intention. When she reached Tom, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. General Vance stopped just a few feet away. The old man had been quietly wiping down a baseboard near the corner, head down, focused on the same task he'd done for years. But this time, he was seen. The general straightened, looked him directly in the eye, and raised her hand in a perfect, crisp salute. Not casual. Not polite. A full, formal military salute. You could hear hearts pounding. A cadet near the aisle gasped. Another dropped the pen he'd been holding. The silence wasn't just stunned, it was reverent. And then the general said, just loud enough to be heard throughout the hushed hall, Command Sergeant Major Hayes. It's an honor to finally stand before you. Not Janitor. Not Mr. Command Sergeant Major. That single title shattered every assumption, every joke, every insult the cadets had ever thrown in Tom Hayes' direction. And for the first time in years, the man they had mocked as Sergeant Scrub slowly raised his hand and returned the salute. The silence had turned into something sacred. And the lesson was just beginning. The air in the assembly hall had transformed. It no longer buzzed with ambition or formalities. It hung heavy, holding its breath, on the precipice of something profound. The cadets who once saw Tom Hayes as part of the building's faded decor now stared at him as if seeing a ghost step out of history. General Abigail Vance remained standing at attention, her arm held high in a formal salute to the custodian. And as Tom returned the gesture, slow, deliberate, precise, it was as if the very walls of Fortis Point Institute remembered what true honor looked like. Then the general turned to face the entire room. Her voice, though calm, carried the undeniable weight of command, the kind of voice used to issuing orders in the heat of battle, the kind that made soldiers move before they even thought. Before I begin my address, she said, there's someone here who deserves far more recognition than I ever could. The cadets sat motionless, frozen in their perfect posture, eyes locked on the general, or rather, the custodian near the corridor. This man, General Vance continued, her voice resonating with power, led men into the heart of darkness while most of you were still learning to tie your boots. He doesn't have a wing or hall named after him here, but if there were justice, he would. A murmur stirred in the back rows. One cadet whispered, "Who is he?" Another clutched a notepad, too stunned to write. "You know him as the head of custodial services." "I knew him as my commanding non-commissioned officer, the man who saved my life and the lives of my entire intelligence team during Operation Ghostfire." Gasps broke out like ripples in still water. Operation Ghostfire. That name had existed in the shadows of military legend, whispers, and rumors. It was said to be a suicide mission, an extraction gone wrong, terrain hostile, intelligence compromised. The odds were impossible. And yet, someone had led a team out alive. Until now, that someone was just a legend. Now he had a face. General Vance nodded toward Tom and continued, "Command Sergeant Major Thomas Hayes isn't in your textbooks. Most of his record is still classified. He didn't come here for recognition. He came here because he believes that even when history forgets your name, your duty never ends." At that moment, every memory of mockery came rushing back to the cadets, every joke, every whisper, every insult. Cadet Jordan Miller, the loudest of them all, sat rigid, his face pale, jaw tight. The general looked back at Tom with something deeper than respect, awe. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "I've waited over 20 years to do this face to face. You didn't just save lives, you taught us what leadership truly is." Tom didn't puff up. He didn't bask in the applause that didn't come, because the room was still too stunned to even clap. He simply gave the slightest nod, as if he'd known this moment would come, not because he wanted it, but because the truth has a way of rising eventually. And now it had. The man they had dismissed as just another janitor was a living ghost from military legend, a warfighter whose courage had pulled others out of darkness. And suddenly, all the shiny uniforms and perfectly rehearsed salutes in that room felt small, because now they saw what real honor looked like. And it wore gray. The silence in the grand hall lingered, not out of formality, but out of reverence. You could hear nothing but the faint buzz of overhead lights and the low hum of breath held in collective awe. General Vance turned to Tom Hayes and said softly, "Command Sergeant Major, would you favor us with a few words?" "Sir." Tom hesitated for a moment. He glanced at the room, hundreds of cadets in polished uniforms, many of whom had barely looked at him before today. He looked at the instructors lining the walls, the polished plaques behind them, the flag gently shifting on its pole. Then slowly, Tom stepped forward. He didn't take the podium. He didn't ask for a microphone. He simply stood, old boots, gray uniform and all, and began to speak in a low, even voice that carried more weight than thunder. "I'm not here to be honored," he began. "I'm here for the ones who never came back." You could feel the gravity in those words. Cadets shifted in their seats. Some dropped their eyes. Others leaned in. "Leadership," he continued, "isn't about shouting the loudest or marching the straightest. It's about shouldering responsibility when no one's watching. It's about looking into chaos and choosing courage anyway, especially when the people you're responsible for look to you with fear in their eyes." He paused. "You wear these uniforms with pride, and you should. But understand this, rank doesn't make you worthy. Actions do. Sacrifice does. Humility does." His eyes scanned the room slowly, landing on faces young enough to still think they're invincible. "In my unit, we had a rule: no one eats until everyone's safe. No one sleeps until the perimeter's secure. That wasn't written in any manual. It came from respect. And I lost good men following that rule, men whose names you'll never read because they died before history could remember them." Tom's voice faltered just once. "They weren't perfect. But they were brave. And their silence bought you the right to sit here today." A few cadets swallowed hard. One near the front blinked back tears. "When I clean these halls," Tom said, "I'm not just pushing a broom. I'm walking through memories. I'm honoring ghosts. I'm remembering voices that'll never speak again." Then came the line that would echo long after the ceremony ended: "If you truly want to lead, learn how to see the unseen. Not just those above you but those below, around, behind. Because the best leaders never forget anyone." He said nothing more. No dramatic conclusion. No call for applause. He stepped back, arms behind him, head lowered with quiet dignity. And that was enough. The room stayed silent long after Tom Hayes finished speaking. No applause. No movement. Just quiet, thick with reflection, and heavier than any metal ever pinned on a chest. It wasn't the kind of silence people fall into out of boredom. It was the kind that demands reverence, that makes you aware of the space you're standing in, and the weight of those who came before you. Then one sound broke through. A chair creaked from the middle row. Cadet First Class Jordan Miller slowly stood. His face, once so full of pride and mockery, was pale, drawn. His jaw clenched as if trying to hold back everything he suddenly felt but didn't yet know how to say. All eyes turned toward him, but he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Tom. He stepped forward a few feet, swallowed hard, and spoke, not with arrogance, not with bravado, but with something new: humility. "Sir," Jordan said, his voice raw, "I'm sorry. For everything. For the jokes. The disrespect. I didn't know. But that's no excuse." Tom didn't respond with a speech. He didn't make a point of the apology. He simply gave Jordan a small nod, subtle but full of meaning. Forgiveness, delivered without fanfare. And then something remarkable happened. Another cadet stood. Then another. And another. Soon, every single cadet in the room was rising to their feet, not because they were told to, but because they needed to. One by one, they saluted. No words. No ceremony. Just raised hands and silent understanding. Some looked ashamed. Others looked inspired. A few blinked back tears. But all of them stood tall, not for a general, not for protocol, but for a man they had once overlooked. For Tom Hayes. General Vance, standing to the side, said nothing. She simply stepped back deliberately, giving Tom the full weight of the moment. She knew, as only seasoned leaders do, when it was time to lead and when it was time to let others feel the gravity of truth on their own. This wasn't her moment. It belonged to Tom. In that instant, the Institute, so full of honor codes, parade drills and formalities, was reminded of something purer than tradition. Respect isn't commanded, it's earned. And once earned, it demands to be given, even by those who once withheld it. Tom stood still, almost overwhelmed by the sea of salutes before him. But he didn't weep. He didn't smile. He simply bowed his head slightly in return, not for himself, but for the brothers he had lost, the ones who never came home, the ones whose faces no cadet in this room would ever see, but whose sacrifices had paved every brick in this institute. In those few minutes, redemption was offered, and more importantly, respect was restored. Not because Tom asked for it, but because the truth could no longer be ignored. And in that quiet hall, full of rising cadets and a bowed hero, history was rewritten, not in ink but in action. The last salute had barely fallen when Tom Hayes turned. No grand farewell. No handshake parade. No final words. Just a quiet pivot and the soft, steady sound of rubber wheels rolling across polished marble. He walked away with his broom cart, same pace, same posture, as if the last 15 minutes hadn't turned the entire institute upside down, as if he hadn't just shifted the meaning of respect in that hall forever. No camera followed him. No officer escorted him. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He didn't need it. He disappeared around the corner like a ghost returning to the shadows. But something had changed. This time, every eye followed him. Every cadet stood a little straighter. Not because they had to, but because they understood. For once, they didn't see a janitor walking away. They saw a man who had lived the cost of command, carried the weight of silence, and chose humility over recognition. And that image, that quiet, humble exit, spoke louder than any speech ever could. Because in a world obsessed with titles, with status, with who stands at the front of the room, Tom Hayes showed that true greatness walks quietly, with its head bowed and its hands calloused. He didn't leave with applause. He left with silence, earned, not given. Because it's not a title that makes you honorable, it's sacrifice, unseen, uncelebrated, unshakable. In every generation, there are those who serve without asking for praise, who return from war and fade into the backdrop of everyday life, working jobs no one notices, walking paths no one honors. They carry more than memory, they carry pain and principles, and the names of friends who never made it back. Tom Hayes was one of them. And today the cadets at Fortis Point Military Institute didn't just learn about him, they learned what he stood for: honor that doesn't need an audience, leadership that doesn't crave attention, and a legacy that doesn't need to be carved in stone to last forever. As the doors to the assembly hall slowly closed behind him, one cadet, still at attention, whispered almost to himself, that was the real commander. It's not the stars on your shoulder or the medals on your chest that define who you are. It's how you carry yourself when no one's watching, and how you treat those who carry the burden of sacrifice. If you believe no veteran should ever be forgotten, share this story so the world remembers the quiet heroes still walking among us. Sometimes the people who teach us the most never say a word. They don't wear medals, demand recognition, or chase applause. They show up, do the hard work, and carry the weight of sacrifice quietly. Tom Hayes reminded us of something we often forget in today's fast-paced world. Respect isn't about titles, it's about character. And leadership isn't how loud you speak, but how deeply you serve, especially when no one's watching. In modern America, where we often measure worth by status, wealth, or online followings, this story challenges us to look again. To slow down. To ask, who are we overlooking? The custodian? The veteran living alone? The neighbor with the quiet eyes? Maybe someone in your own life has lived through storms you'll never see, and still shows up each day with dignity. So, here's what we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever met someone like Tom, a quiet hero in your community? Or maybe you have a story like his, one that hasn't been told yet? Please share it in the comments below. Let's make sure their legacy doesn't fade. And if this story moved your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Because keeping stories like Tom's alive, that's how we honor those who gave more than we'll ever know. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you pass someone in silence, you'll see them a little differently.